first, some interesting facts about why we vote the way we do. So we made some slides here to sort of walk you through it. Voting the American way. So first slide coming up right here. On a Tuesday. Why do we vote on a Tuesday? Well, this all goes back to America's agrarian past. In 1845, Congress selected Tuesday to give farmers time to make their journey to the county seat where elections were held. So that was a long buggy trip, and it was either going to be Tuesday or Wednesday, and Wednesday was a market day, so Tuesday it was, and a little bit later it was codified in 1875 when Congress extended that Tuesday date to voting for federal House elections. Then a little later in 1914, the Senate got in on the action. So Tuesday it is, but in November fit nicely, again, back to our agrarian roots, into that harvest time, and it was before the brutal winters when getting your horse and buggy into the polls was not a priority if you lived far away. And then 1888, Massachusetts pioneered, and they were the first state to adopt a secret ballot system, which of course caught on a little bit. Moving on, we're going to look at pulling the levers. So we found out why we vote the way we do. Let's see how we're voting. In the U.S., on average, 60% of eligible voters actually showed up to cast a vote in the last presidential election. And we look at midterm elections, that number dropped steeply nationally to about 40% voter turnout during elections. Again, looking at that presidential election year, about 50% of eligible young people, in this instance we're saying 18 to 29 years old, actually showed up to cast a vote in 2012. That accounted for some 23 million votes. So lastly, some people who aren't pulling the lever, well, in Maine and Vermont, they allow felons to actually vote from prison. But other states permanently ban felons from voting even after being released from prison, parole, on probation, or having paid all of their fines. And we happen to be sitting in one of those states, New York, that restricts that. So that's a little look at voting the American way. Now, let's get into the A block. All right, we're back. Now, while obstacles to registration and voting get lots of attention come election season, our guests are removing those barriers a full-time job. John Opdycke is the president of Open Primaries. They're an organization advocating for a nonpartisan primary system, among other things. Welcome, John.
Glad to be here.
And we're also happy to welcome the Assistant Executive Director for Public Affairs at the New York City Campaign Finance Board. He's Eric Friedman. Thanks for joining us, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
So what felt like a long time ago, we had Scott Stringer here talking about voter turnout. And here in New York City, I have a number, like 61% of the people showed up in 2008 to make a presidential election. When we were time for the governor to be elected, that number dropped to what, 25%. So that's a sort of precipitous drop. So what do you think the open primaries have a contributing factor in that, in the fact that it's sort of restrictive? If you're not registered Dem or Republican in this state, you got to wait to the general.
Well, open primaries responds to a very important trend in New York and nationally, which is that the fastest growing segment of voters are people that don't want to join a political party. They're independents. Now, there's been some interesting new research that debunks a lot of the myths about independents, that they're lazy, they're fence sitters, they're apathetic. Independents are actually asserting they want to vote for people, not parties. They want to follow the issues. They want to use their vote in ways that advance things they care about, as opposed to just blindly voting for a party.
Gotcha.
But New York and many other states systematically discriminate against those voters, and the consequences are very dramatic. I mean, 37% of millennial voters, for example, in New York are independent.
Yeah.
So the first time they're eligible to vote in a presidential election that's highly competitive, the message is don't participate.
Right.
So that's a statement that gets made to new voters, new participants, and that has a huge impact on the overall culture of New York politics.
Well, looking at New York City's campaign, the Finance Board, you guys are pioneering. You've been around since the late 80s. Right. When did you get into the business of doing this instead of tracking who I'm donating to?
Well, we're doing that too.
Okay, still doing that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working for the last few years. We've had a voter outreach, voter engagement campaign, which we call NYC Votes. I mean, I think you raise a really interesting kind of dynamic. You know, we've got a campaign finance system in New York City that encourages people to participate by making small donations to candidates. Right. We've got a voting system that throws up barriers to voters at every step along the way. This is 2016, right? We live in a smartphone world, but we have an election system that was designed for the age of rotary telephones. The cracks are starting to show, and the turnout numbers that you brought up earlier, I think, are evidence of that. When 25% of New Yorkers are voting in those midterm elections,
That's right.
it means, it's not the voters' fault. It means that there are some systematic issues that we need to face. So we, working with other groups, we have what we're calling the Vote Better New York Coalition. And we've got a really, I think, common sense agenda that'll bring some real, that'll upgrade the system and try to open up some of those barriers so that the system works for all voters, whether you are want to affiliate with a party or not. So first is to make it easier for people to register to vote. It means, I mean, you mentioned the Trump kids at the top of the show, right? This is the first time in a generation that we've had a competitive primary for president in New York.
In the state,
right?
Yeah.
Back in October of last year, it's not at all clear that would be the case, right? But that was the deadline if you wanted to affiliate with a party.
Yeah.
If you wanted to vote next week.
Exactly.
So one of the things that legislation that we're supporting, the Voter Empowerment Act, would bring that deadline in line with the deadline to register to vote 10 days before the primary.
Gotcha.
It would expand online voter registration. Right now, you can register online if you are a customer of the DMV, if you have a driver's license. Right. In New York City, you don't need a driver's license to get around. Your Metro card. So it would throw open online registration for all voters, all New Yorkers. But beyond that, it would make it the government's responsibility to get you on the voter rolls in the first place, right? So if you interact with state government, if you're on state assistance, if you apply for a hunting license,
is with the state,
right? They're going to get you on the voter rolls,
right?
We have 2 million eligible voters across New York State who aren't registered.
Right.
We got to get those people on the voter rolls so that they can take that first step.
You met John in the hall. He's a nice guy. You guys going to get on the open primary bandwagon? Because that system would still lock out all of those independent people who Bernie Sanders is really hoping can turn out for him sometime next week.
Listen, New York is one of the most restrictive states when it comes to primaries, no doubt.
Why is that? Why are we so far behind? Scott Stringer came and he underlined a lot of technology issues, like why we're still so archaic in our interactions with voting. But why is New York State so restrictive?
Bottom line is we have a system that's designed for the interests of the parties and not the interests of the voters. Right. When you put the voters first, a lot of these issues kind of rise to the surface. One is getting people registered. Another is giving people more time to vote. Yeah. There are 33 states in the country where you don't have to vote on Tuesday. Right. Where you can vote up to 2 weeks before Election Day.
Right. Or have an excuse for wanting to vote early or send in a ballot.
No, that's exactly right. We need to expand that. What we're talking about in New York is about 12 days before the election, including weekends, so that you don't have to make a choice between taking time off of work and going to cast your vote. You're required, businesses are required to give you time off, right? And so we're working with the Better New York partnerships for New York and for New York City and small business services to communicate to employers. We've reached out to about 80,000 businesses across New York City, representing 1 million employees, to make sure that they know you're allowed to take time off to vote. But we shouldn't have to make people make that choice. Yeah. You need that 12-day, 2-week period before the election so that you're not locked into that Tuesday.
Right.
And we need ballots that are easier to read.
Yeah.
Right. We switched to the ballot scanners about 7 or 8 years ago. Right. We still use ballots that are designed for the old lever machines. Well,
there's still a movement afoot as well to introduce a new form of voting where you can actually rank your choices, because we always go back to cost concerns, particularly in states. So in this system, you could say, this is my first choice, this is my second, this is my third, to avoid a costly runoff that may or may not happen or take some time or get some money. But I wanted to ask you, Eric, about this top-down approach that you mentioned, the systems. The Supreme Court recently had their decision about redistricting, whether we're going to count residents versus people who are registered. Does that make your job any easier?
I don't think it's a big issue. I think in some ways, I just want to go back to your previous question, because I think it was a great question.
There's a lot of stuff in there.
Because New York's system is so antiquated, and Eric's absolutely right. Technologically, politically, there's 1 million problems with it. Yeah. I think, however, that the good government community in New York has been insufficiently radical, insufficiently willing to take on as Eric said, the fact that the system is designed for the parties and not for the voters. Yes, of course, we need easier voter registration. We need more technologically advanced things in a million ways. Right. That's just the start. We have to redesign New York's political process so that the voters have maximum mobility, control, ability to participate,
so
and that means taking on the political parties.
Well, that's where I'm going. Clearly, the voters are not the beneficiaries of this antiquated system. So who is maintaining their great status by making sure that the voters are almost an afterthought in the election?
Political parties are private institutions. They're private organizations. Now, their job is to get people elected to the legislature, to Congress, and so forth. It is much easier to get people elected in a system where you control who gets to vote. It's just basic market economics. Yeah. That's why they don't support same-day voter registration and open primaries and nonpartisan administration of elections. You know, when the politicians get to choose the voters as opposed to the voters choosing the politicians, it's just much more predictable. And that's one of the reasons the primaries are so important. One of the dirty little secrets about New York politics, 90% of the elections in November are completely uncompetitive. Yeah. The decision was made in the primary. In New York City, even the de Blasio election.
Particularly in New York, we're guilty of this. Yeah.
I mean, de Blasio, the media called it a landslide. I mean, 13% of the people supported him. Right. Because after the primary, he could have gone to the Caribbean for 2 months. He didn't even have to campaign.
Well, I think Bloomberg has a plane. But looking at the system the way it is now, what do you think is the paramount reform that people could really run after, and then things will start to coalesce once we make this one underlying effort, and then people will see, wow, we can make big changes? If there was one thing that you guys really had to put your shoulders behind, what would you pick it to be?
Well, I mean, we've laid out what I think are the three things that work together.
All right, your three pillars.
Right, is getting more people on the rolls. Gotcha. Giving people more time to vote, and making it easier for people to cast a vote that counts. Okay. Right. So New York City alone, in the last midterm election, about 100,000 votes thrown out because people couldn't read the ballot. Right. So I mean, this is the most basic instrument of democracy, and people can't figure out how to make their voice heard clearly. Right. So I mean, you know, but I think all three of these things work together. It's a basic upgrade for an election system that is woefully out of date.
I'm biased. Allow everybody to vote in the first round, in the primaries. I mean, there's more independents in New York City than Republicans. This is not a tiny faction of people. This is a growing, surging group of Americans and New Yorkers who say, I don't want to join a political party to participate. And we're saying to them, sorry, you're a second-class citizen. We have to empower that grouping of people. We have to empower all voters so they have more capacity to choose and vote for candidates that are not in lockstep. That's going to open up the door, in my opinion. That's going to give the voters, that's going to reposition the voters to be able to make a lot of more of the common sense changes that Eric is talking about that we need. But right now, the voters, we're not in the driver's seat. Right. We're not even in the back seat. We're kind of in the trunk.
No, look, John has it exactly right. You know, we've traveled to Albany. We've brought a group up to Albany the last few years to talk to legislators about these ideas. And you know, I'm not going to call anybody out by name, but you know,
say their names. No. We say names on this show.
No, but you go to some elected officials, and what you hear is, "I like the system the way it is. You know, it got me here. Wow. I know it." And I trust the system. Absolutely. And so what our role is to go up there and make sure the voice of the voter gets into that conversation. Yeah. Ultimately, change isn't going to come until the elected officials realize that voters care, and they're going to stand up and demand that they get access.
Okay, we literally have 40 seconds, so I'm going to ask you, how do we make the voters care? If our votes don't matter as much as they should in driving the process, how do we use our feet, our influence, to really make a systematic change?
Come to the rally.
Who have a vested interest in things not changing.
Come to the Open Primaries press conference Thursday at noon at City Hall. Make your voice heard. Come out and support. 12 o'clock noon, City Hall in Manhattan. Assemblyman Fred Thiel is going to be there. He's introduced 2 important bills in the New York State Assembly for open primaries. independent leaders and activists, open primaries advocates, young people, millennial voters are going to be there. It's a great opportunity to increase the profile of this important issue.
All right,
So
last word.
I got 2 things for you. Go to change.org, search for Vote Better New York. We've got a petition. There's about 5,000 signatures we've collected so far online and in print. So go sign our petition. Come with us to Albany, May 3rd. Vote Better New York Coalition traveling to Albany to bring these issues directly to the legislature.
Thank you so much. This was enlightening. You have to come
Brian.
back and update us.
Absolutely.